Hi, I'm Nick Birmingham and welcome to part 3 of my video on how I made my Yew Longbow. To recap, in part 2 I showed you how I began marking out the bow, selecting the usable centre of the stave to avoid any imperfections, defining the grip and the ends of the limbs, and finally removing the excess wood with the bandsaw. In this video I'll explain how I marked out the side profile of the bow, cut off the last of the excess wood and completed the final shaping of the bow using a farrier's rasp and a couple of scrapers. Before we get to the dimensions for the side of the bow, it's worth understanding their significance, as it's the depth of a bow that has the most effect on its power. During the Middle Ages, when the English military bowman was required to shoot heavy arrows over great distances, there was a need for very powerful bows. The way to create this power was to make bows that were deep in the centre, as it's this wood which becomes compressed as the tips of the limbs come around. The more wood that must be compressed as the bow is drawn, so the harder that task becomes. This does, however, present a problem, because as you make a bow deeper, you increase the stress on the limbs, especially if the bow has a riser or stiff centre section. To combat this, bows were made full compass. They were shaped in such a way that the bow bent along its entire length, even through the grip, so helping to distribute those forces evenly. So now we know how the depth of wood on the belly of a bow affects its performance. It's time to see how it was marked out. The first step was to transfer the major lines from the top of the bow to the sides, these being the centre line, 1 inch and 3 inch lines of the grip, seen here on the stave, and the 7 inch line from the ends of the limbs. If we pause at this photo, you'll notice that the sapwood is very uneven on this part of the stave, with the surface lower on the far side than on the near. So the join between the sapwood and the heartwood is also lower on that side of the stave than the one nearest the camera. This is something that caused me a problem later on, but I'll go into more detail about that when we come to it. With the lines transferred down the sides, it was time to measure the thickness of wood required at each of these points, and it's worth repeating that the measurements I chose were to give me a draw weight of 110 to 115 pounds at a draw length of 32 inches. Starting with the tips of the limbs, I intended to make them round, so the measurement on the side was marked at ½ an inch, the same as on the top. At the 7 inch mark I measured down 20 mm, and for the centre section all 3 lines were marked to 38 mm, so that the final bow would be slightly wider than it is deep. This is a common feature of medieval bows, or at least I should say the Tudor ones we examine the most, as it makes the cross section slightly more oval than the higher D section of a typical Victorian style target bow. To mark out the rest of the bow, I plotted a series of lines at 4 inch intervals from the centre line, ending at 40 inches, which, given the 1 inch left over at the end of each limb, gave me my total stave length of 82 inches. To work out the depth required at each of these points, I measured the width of the bow at that point, seen here as dimension A, and then subtracted 6 mm, giving me dimension B. Once depth was marked at each point, it was a simple case of joining all the dots together to give me the final outline of the side of the bow. It was now time to take the stave to the saw and remove the excess wood along the side, and it was at this point that the different levels of the sap on one limb became a problem. Without thinking, I placed the stave on the plate and began following the cut line with the bandsaw, but suddenly remembering the offset of the sapwood, I checked the other side of the stave and, sure enough, found I was starting to cut through the guide mark on the other side. So let's examine why that was. This cross section at the tip of the limb shows the problem I faced, with the curve of the original trunk causing the layer of sapwood to be lower on one side of the stave than the other. As I wanted the tips to be round, I marked the depth at each side of the bow to be the same as the width, i.e. half an inch, but in doing so failed to realise the implications of that when it came to cut out the stave. With the stave on the bandsaw, I followed the higher of the two lines, causing the blade to begin cutting above the depth mark on the other side. So what I should have done was follow the lower of the two marks and simply deal with the remaining wood later with the rasp. Fortunately, I noticed in time, so there was no real harm done. But if you happen to make your own bow, then I would recommend you check the progress of your cut at intervals along the stave to make sure they are at the same height and avoid a similar mistake. With the bandsaw stage completed, I had some extra wood to remove with the farrier's rasp due to that twist in the sap, but once that was completed, I finally had something that was starting to resemble a bow. To complete the shaping process, I now needed to transform the cross section from the squared stave I still had to something resembling this smooth oval or low D shape. To accomplish this, I marked a line along the entire length of the stave 1/8 of an inch in from each edge of the sapwood, and then at 1/4 of an inch in from each edge of the heartwood. Then, using the scraper on the more delicate sapwood and the harsher farrier's rasp on the heartwood, I removed the wood between those lines, running the scraper and rasp along at roughly a 45-degree angle. Now came the most labour-intensive part of the entire build, working with the rasp and a couple of different styles of scraper to round off all those edges, contour the belly and give the bow its final shape. With the final shaping process completed, all that remained was to fit the horn nocks and tiller the bow, but I'll cover that in part 4, the final episode in this series. I'll see you then.